Hello, my dear friends. Most people think medieval people were simply dirty, but the truth is far more uncomfortable than that. What looks filthy on the surface is only half of the story, and in many cases, the worst parts were the ones no one could see. Men carried dirt that everyone could smell, while women often endured something that stayed hidden and lasted much longer. The real question is not who was dirtier, but who had no escape from it. Tonight, we step into a world where cleanliness was not a choice, but something people had to survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone were asked who was dirtier in the Middle Ages, men or women, the answer might seem obvious at first. Many would immediately think of women as less clean, shaped by associations with blood, childbirth, and long hours spent inside enclosed spaces where air and light did not circulate freely. The image feels convincing, almost automatic, as if it does not need to be questioned. Layers of fabric, bodies kept within the same environment for most of the day, and routines that allowed little room for proper washing all contribute to that assumption. It seems simple, almost too simple, and that is where the problem begins. Men lived under very different conditions, ones that left marks on the body in ways that could not be ignored. Their work placed them outside for most of the day, moving through fields thick with mud, along roads covered in dust, inside workshops where ash and residue clung to every surface. We did not just appear. It built up slowly and continuously, soaking into clothing that was not designed to be changed frequently. By the time evening arrived, their bodies carried everything they had passed through, as if the day itself had settled onto their skin. The result was immediate and unmistakable. The smell of labour was not subtle. It lingered in the air around them, a mixture of sweat, dirt, and whatever materials their work had involved. It did not require attention to be noticed. It did not need explanation. It simply existed, strong enough to define how others perceived them before any words were exchanged. In many ways, this became the standard image of what it meant to be unclean during that time. Yet this form of dirt had a certain advantage, even if it did not seem like one. It was exposed. It was on the surface. And because of that, it could sometimes be reduced, even if only slightly. A man could stop at a well, rinse his hands, splash water across his face, or wipe away some of the grime before stepping inside. These actions did not restore cleanliness in a full sense, but they created small breaks in the cycle. For a moment, the body could feel separated from what it had been carrying. Women did not experience dirt in the same visible way, but that did not make their situation easier. Their work kept them close to fabrics, to beds, to enclosed spaces that did not change much from one day to the next. Their clothing was made of layers that served both practical and social purposes, and those layers were not meant to be removed frequently. The fabric closest to the skin absorbed moisture, but it could not always be replaced as often as needed. Outer layers remained in place, holding warmth close to the body and limiting airflow. From a distance, this created a different impression. Women often appeared more orderly, their clothing arranged carefully, their presence less chaotic than that of men returning from physical labour. There were fewer obvious signs of dirt, no heavy mud, no ash, no immediate smell that spread across a room. It gave the sense that they were cleaner, or at least better maintained. But that sense depended entirely on what could be seen. It is easy to assume that the dirtiest person is the one who looks the worst, but that assumption begins to fail the moment time is taken into account. What appears quickly can also be removed quickly. What remains hidden may stay far longer, shaping the body in ways that are not immediately visible. The daily reality of hygiene in the Middle Ages did not allow for complete cleaning. Water had to be collected, heated, and used carefully. There was no expectation of frequent bathing in the modern sense. People adapted instead. They wiped their skin, changed linen when possible, and endured what could not be addressed. Cleanliness became something temporary, something that could never be fully achieved, only managed. For men, the challenge was constant exposure to new sources of dirt. Every task added another layer, another smell, another trace that had to be carried. For women, the challenge was continuity. The same layers of fabric, the same enclosed spaces, and the same limited opportunities for washing created a condition that did not reset easily. What built up did so quietly, without dramatic signs, but with a persistence that could not be ignored by the person experiencing it. If we compare this to today, it would be like seeing someone covered in dirt after a long day outside and assuming they are worse off than someone who has not been able to wash or change for several days, simply because the second condition is not immediately visible. The difference lies in how long the body must carry what it cannot remove. Social expectations deepened this contrast. A man could smell of sweat and still be understood. His condition reflected his work, and that work justified the state of his body. A woman, however, was expected to maintain a certain level of order, regardless of her situation. If she appeared unclean, it could be taken as a failure, not just a circumstance. This created a quiet pressure, one that forced her to manage appearances even when the reality beneath them was far more difficult. Something is unsettling about realizing that the people who appeared cleaner were often the ones with fewer chances to escape what they carried. The absence of visible dirt did not mean the absence of discomfort. It meant that it was hidden, controlled, and endured without the same acknowledgement. At this point, the question itself begins to change. It is no longer about who looks worse at the end of the day. It becomes a question of who can step away from the dirt they carry, even briefly, and who remains within it without interruption. The answer does not settle easily on one side. Instead, it reveals two different experiences, each shaped by daily life, by expectation, and by what the body is forced to endure. This part has shown that what looks obvious at first becomes uncertain once both sides are placed side by side. As the focus moves closer to the body itself, the difference begins to shift away from what can be seen and toward what cannot be easily removed. Because what comes next is not just about dirt on the skin, but about sweat that soaks into clothing for entire days, creating a smell that does not fade, but slowly settles into the body itself. Men in the Middle Ages moved through environments that did not allow the body to remain separate from the world around it. Their daily routines placed them directly into fields, workshops, roads, and animal spaces where the ground itself was never clean. From early morning, the body began to collect what the day offered. Soil clung to boots and then to clothing. Dust settled into hair and onto exposed skin. Hands came into contact with tools, animals, and surfaces that transferred layers of residue without pause. There was no clear moment when the body remained untouched. Every task added something new, and nothing was fully removed before the next layer arrived. Farming was one of the most common forms of work, and it ensured constant exposure to mud and moisture. Fields were rarely dry, and even when they appeared firm, the soil still carried dampness that clung to anything pressing against it. Walking, bending, lifting, and carrying meant repeated contact with the ground. The lower parts of clothing absorbed this contact first, but over time it spread upward. Knees pressed into earth, hands pushed into soil, and the body gradually took on the condition of the land itself. It was not an occasional occurrence, it was continuous, repeating day after day without interruption. Animal work added another layer that was even harder to ignore. Handling livestock meant direct contact with waste, with fur, with bodily fluids that could not be avoided. Stables were enclosed spaces where smells gathered and remained. Moving through them meant carrying those smells outward, attaching them to clothing and skin. Even after leaving, the body did not return to a neutral state. The scent stayed, embedded in fabric, lingering long after the work had ended. It was not something that could be shaken off or quickly wiped away. Work in workshops created a different but equally persistent condition. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and labourers dealt with ash, soot, grease, and fine particles that settled into every exposed surface. Heat intensified the process. Sweat opened the pores of the skin, allowing these materials to adhere more easily and more deeply. The result was a layer that did not sit loosely on the surface, but seemed to merge with it. Hands darkened, arms carried streaks that did not fade with simple wiping, and clothing became heavy with what it had absorbed. Sweat itself was constant. It did not come in brief moments, but remained present throughout the day. Physical labor demanded it, and the lack of frequent washing meant it accumulated rather than disappeared. Fabric closest to the body absorbed it first, becoming damp and then remaining that way for long periods. As more sweat was produced, it mixed with what had already been absorbed. Dust, soil, and residue settled into this moisture, creating a combination that did not dry cleanly. Instead, it thickened, forming something that stayed with the body long after the activity had stopped. Clothing played a central role in this process. Garments were not changed frequently, and they were not washed daily. The same layers that protected the body also trapped what the body produced. Sweat, dirt, and external substances remained within the fabric, building slowly over time. Even when the body rested, the clothing continued to hold what had been collected during the day. It pressed against the skin, maintaining contact with everything it had absorbed. There was no clear separation between the body and the material covering it. It is difficult to separate where the body ends and where the day's labor begins when everything has been absorbed into the same surface. The distinction fades when sweat, soil, and fabric become part of a single condition that does not reset easily. Travel made this situation even more pronounced. Men who moved between locations, whether for trade, work, or other obligations, carried their environment with them. Roads were long, often unpaved, and filled with dust or mud depending on the season. Walking through them meant constant exposure without access to consistent cleaning. Inns and shared sleeping spaces did not offer relief. They often introduced new layers of dirt, as multiple people shared the same limited space. What one person carried could easily transfer to another, creating a cycle where nothing was fully removed, only replaced or added to. The smell that resulted from this accumulation was immediate and unmistakable. It did not require closeness to detect. It moved outward, carried by the air, marking the presence of someone who had spent the entire day in physical labor. Sweat combined with soil, with animals, with the materials of work, and with the lack of washing. It was not a single scent, but a mixture that deepened over time. Each day added to it, making it more difficult to ignore and more difficult to separate into individual parts. If we compare this to today, it would be like wearing the same clothing after intense physical work for multiple days, allowing sweat and dirt to settle into the fabric until the smell becomes part of the body itself. The difference is that in the Middle Ages, this was not an exception or a temporary situation. It was the normal state for many men across different levels of society. Despite the intensity of this condition, there were still small interruptions that created moments of relief. A man might rinse his hands in water before eating, splash his face, or wipe parts of his body with a cloth. These actions did not remove everything, but they created brief separations between the body and what it carried. Even a short contact with water could reduce the immediate sensation, if only for a limited time. These moments mattered, not because they solved the problem, but because they showed that the problem could, at least partially, be interrupted. This created an important distinction. The dirt that men carried was heavy, visible, and often overwhelming, but it was also connected to actions that had clear beginnings and endings. Work started, work ended, and within that cycle, there were small opportunities to step away from what had been accumulated. The body was not completely trapped within it, even if the relief was temporary. There is something deceptive about how visible dirt can seem worse, simply because it is easier to notice, even when it allows moments of escape that are not always available in other conditions. The intensity of the experience does not always reflect how long it must be endured. By the end of the day, the body still carried much of what it had gathered. Clothing remained heavy, skin remained marked, and the smell did not disappear. Yet the possibility of brief separation remained, even if it was limited. This possibility becomes important when placed beside conditions where no such separation exists. This part has shown how men's bodies became saturated with sweat, mud, and smell through constant exposure to labor and environment, creating a form of dirt that was immediate and highly visible. But when the source of uncleanliness shifts away from the outside world and into the body itself, the experience changes in a way that cannot be interrupted so easily. Because what comes next is not something that can be wiped away or rinsed even briefly, but something tied to the body's own functions, where moisture and fabric remain in contact for days, slowly becoming impossible to escape. The conditions surrounding women's bodies in the Middle Ages created a form of uncleanliness that was not immediately visible, yet far more difficult to escape once it began. Their daily lives were not defined by constant exposure to fields or roads, but by close and repeated contact with fabrics, enclosed spaces, and the rhythms of the body itself. What they carried did not announce itself across a room. It stayed near the skin, contained within layers that were not easily removed, and often remained for longer than a single day could allow. Much of this came from the natural cycles of the body, which could not be paused or adjusted to match the limitations of their environment. Menstruation, for example, required continuous management over several days, yet the materials available were simple and limited. Cloth was commonly used, sometimes layered or folded, but it could not be replaced as frequently as needed. Washing it was not always immediate, and drying it depended on conditions that were not always available. As a result, moisture remained in contact with the body for extended periods, creating a condition that was not just uncomfortable, but persistent. This was not a brief moment that could be addressed quickly. It lasted, often without interruption, shaping how the body felt throughout the day and into the night. Movement did not remove it. Rest did not reduce it. It remained, held in place by layers of fabric that were necessary for modesty and structure. Unlike mud or dust, which could be shaken off or rinsed away in small amounts, this form of uncleanliness stayed close, absorbed into the very materials meant to contain it. Childbirth introduced an even more intense version of this experience. After giving birth, the body did not return to a neutral state quickly. There were fluids, blood, and ongoing physical recovery that extended far beyond a single moment. The bed, the clothing, and the surrounding space all became part of this condition. Changing them was not always easy, and cleaning them was not always possible in the way that would be needed. What resulted was an environment where the body and its surroundings shared the same state, reinforcing it rather than breaking it. Caring for infants added another layer that was just as constant. Feeding, cleaning, and holding a child meant continuous contact with bodily fluids that could not be avoided. Cloths were reused, surfaces were shared, and the cycle repeated throughout the day. There was no clear boundary between one task and the next. What had been absorbed in one moment carried into the following one, creating a continuity that did not allow for full separation. Clothing played a central role in how all of this was experienced. Layers were worn close to the body, and those layers were not designed for frequent removal. Linen absorbed moisture, but it also held onto it. Outer garments trapped warmth, limiting airflow and slowing the drying process. Once moisture entered this system, it did not leave quickly. Instead, it remained, creating a condition where the body stayed damp for longer than it should have. Beds and living spaces extended this effect. Fabrics used for sleeping were not changed daily, and they absorbed what the body released over time. A bed was not just a place of rest, but a place where what could not be removed during the day settled further. The same materials that provided comfort also held onto what the body could not escape. Over time, this created an environment that reflected the condition of the body itself, reinforcing it rather than relieving it. It is easy to overlook what cannot be seen, especially when it does not present itself in an immediate or obvious way. What remains hidden beneath layers of fabric and routine does not disappear simply because it is not visible. It continues, shaping the experience of the person carrying it in ways that are not easily understood from the outside. Unlike the forms of dirt associated with men's labour, this condition did not have clear beginnings and endings. It was not tied to a specific task that could be completed and then left behind. It followed the body through different parts of the day, through different roles, and through different stages of life. There was no single moment where it could be fully set aside. Instead, there were only degrees of management, small adjustments that did not change the overall situation. If we compare this to today, it would be like wearing the same damp clothing against the skin for several days, unable to change or fully clean it, while continuing to move through daily responsibilities without pause. The discomfort would not be immediate and dramatic, but steady, constant, and difficult to ignore once noticed. Social expectations added further complexity. Women were expected to maintain a composed appearance, even when their circumstances made it difficult. Cleanliness was tied not only to comfort, but to perception, and perception carried consequences. This meant that much of what they experienced had to remain hidden. There was little room to acknowledge it openly, and even less opportunity to address it fully. The result was a form of uncleanliness that was both private and continuous. There is something deeply unsettling about a condition that cannot be easily seen, because it allows it to continue without interruption or recognition. What is visible can be addressed, even if imperfectly. What remains hidden can persist, shaping daily life without ever becoming the focus of attention. Over time, this created a different relationship with the body. Instead of dealing with external sources that could be identified and occasionally reduced, women often had to manage conditions that originated from within or remained closely tied to it. The body was not just affected by its environment, it became part of the source of what needed to be managed, creating a cycle that was harder to break. This does not mean that one experience was entirely worse than the other. Instead, it reveals a difference in how uncleanliness was lived. One was immediate, visible, and often overwhelming in the moment. The other was quieter, more contained, and extended over longer periods without clear interruption. Both shaped daily life, but they did so in ways that were not easily compared at a glance. This part has shown how women's experiences of uncleanliness were shaped by the body itself, by fabric, and by environments that did not allow for quick or complete relief. As the comparison continues, the focus begins to move away from individual experiences and toward the conditions that shaped both men and women at the same time. What comes next is not just about bodies or clothing, but about the absence of proper cleaning itself, where the real difference is not who becomes dirty, but who has any way to remove it at all. At the centre of this comparison lies a difference that is easy to miss when attention stays on what is visible. The amount of dirt a body carries can be striking, especially when it builds up through physical labour and exposure to harsh conditions. Mud, sweat, and dust create an image that feels overwhelming at first glance. Yet this image does not tell the full story. What matters more is not how much dirt is present, but whether the body has any chance to separate itself from it, even briefly. A man returning from a long day of work often carries clear signs of what he has done. Soil clings to his clothing, sweat soaks through the fabric, and the smell of labour surrounds him without effort. It is immediate, direct, and difficult to ignore. Anyone nearby can recognise it without needing to look closely. It defines the moment, shaping how he is perceived as soon as he enters a space. But even within this condition, there are small openings where the accumulation can be reduced. Water, when available, offers a brief interruption. A basin, a well, or even a cloth can be used to remove part of what has built up. Hands can be rinsed, faces can be wiped, and some of the weight carried by the body can be lessened. These actions do not restore full cleanliness, but they create a break in the experience. For a short time, the body is no longer entirely covered in what it has gathered. That separation, even if temporary, changes how the condition is felt. This ability to interrupt the state of being unclean creates a rhythm. Dirt builds, reaches a point where it becomes uncomfortable, and is then partially reduced. The cycle continues, but it includes moments where the body is allowed to step away from what it carries. These moments are limited, and they do not solve the problem completely, yet they provide a form of relief that shapes the overall experience. Women, in certain conditions, do not always have access to this rhythm. During childbirth, the body enters a state that cannot be quickly resolved. Fluids, blood, and ongoing physical changes extend far beyond a single moment. The materials available to manage these conditions are simple and often insufficient. Cloth is used, but it must be reused. Washing and drying it cannot always happen immediately, and even when it does, the result does not create a full reset. What remains continues, held close to the body without interruption. A similar pattern appears during the monthly cycle. The body produces what cannot be delayed, and the responsibility of managing it falls entirely on the individual. Fabric absorbs moisture and holds it in place. It stays in contact with the skin for long periods, creating a condition that does not fade quickly. Movement does not remove it, and rest does not reduce it. It continues, shaping the experience of the body across hours and sometimes days. It is not the intensity of the dirt that defines the experience, but the absence of any moment where the body can step outside of it. When there is no interruption, the condition changes from something temporary into something continuous. The body does not move in and out of it, it remains within it. This difference is not always visible to others. A man covered in mud presents an image that draws immediate attention. His condition is clear, and it can be understood without explanation. A woman dealing with conditions that remain hidden beneath layers of fabric does not present the same image. From the outside, there may be little to notice. Clothing appears arranged, the body appears composed, and nothing obvious signals what is being endured. This creates a gap between appearance and experience. The environment reinforces this gap. Open spaces, wells, and basins provide opportunities for washing, even if limited. These opportunities are more accessible to those who move between locations throughout the day. For those whose lives remain within enclosed spaces, access to these moments is more restricted. Water must be brought, prepared, and used carefully. The effort required to create even a brief moment of cleaning becomes a barrier, one that is not always overcome. If we compare this to today, it would be like being able to wash away part of the dirt after a long day, or someone else is forced to remain in the same damp and uncomfortable condition without any real chance to change or clean it. One experience is intense but interrupted, the other is quieter but continuous. Perception does not always align with reality. Visible dirt creates a strong reaction, making it seem worse than anything that remains hidden. It is easy to respond to what can be seen and smelled immediately. It is far more difficult to recognize what does not reveal itself so clearly. As a result, the forms of uncleanliness that persist over time often receive less attention, even though they may be more difficult to endure. There is something deeply unsettling about a condition that continues without being noticed, because it allows it to shape daily life without interruption. What is visible invites response. What remains hidden is allowed to continue. Over time, this changes the nature of the comparison. The question is no longer about who becomes dirtier more quickly or more visibly. It becomes about who has the ability to interrupt that state and who does not. The difference lies in duration, in how long the body must carry what it cannot remove, and in whether there is any point where that burden can be reduced. In this light, the meaning of uncleanliness shifts. It is no longer defined by appearance alone. It is defined by the experience of being unable to step away from what the body holds. What seems worse at first glance may not be what is hardest to endure over time. This part has shown that the harshest form of uncleanliness is not always the most visible, but the one that offers no break once it begins. As attention moves forward, the focus begins to settle on the materials that remain closest to the body and determines how long these conditions can last. The next part examines how layers of clothing, designed to protect and cover, become the very place where moisture, heat, and residue are held in place, extending the experience far beyond a single moment. Clothing in the Middle Ages did more than cover the body. It acted as a barrier, a filter, and sometimes even a container for what the body produced throughout the day. Both men and women relied on layers of fabric, especially linen worn closest to the skin, to absorb sweat and protect outer garments from becoming visibly dirty too quickly. At first glance, this system seems practical. It created a separation between the body and the outer world, allowing people to appear cleaner than they actually were. But the effect of this system was not the same for everyone, and the difference becomes clear when looking at how these layers were worn and how long they remained in place. Linen was valued because it could absorb moisture effectively. When worn directly against the skin, it collected sweat before it reached heavier outer garments. This helped extend the use of more expensive clothing, which could not be washed frequently. For men, this layer functioned in a relatively straightforward way. The linen absorbed sweat during the day and, when possible, it could be changed or aired out. Even when it was not replaced immediately, the structure of men's clothing often allowed for more airflow, especially during physical labor. Movement, exposure to open air, and simpler layering created small opportunities for moisture to dry, even if only partially. For women, the structure of clothing was more complex. Layers were not only practical but also tied to social expectations. Undergarments, skirts, and additional fabric around the lower body created a system where airflow was limited. Each layer added weight and reduced the body's ability to release heat and moisture. Once sweat or other forms of moisture entered this system, it did not leave easily. It remained between layers, held close to the skin, and was prevented from drying quickly. The lower part of the body was particularly affected by this structure. Multiple layers created a closed environment where warmth and moisture combined. This was not a temporary condition that could be quickly resolved. It lasted throughout the day, reinforced by the constant presence of fabric that stayed in place. Even small amounts of moisture became significant when they could not evaporate. Over time, this created a feeling that was not immediately visible, but increasingly difficult to ignore. From the outside, this difference was not obvious. Women often appeared more composed, their clothing arranged carefully, their outer layers remaining relatively clean compared to the visibly dirt-stained garments of men. The system of layered fabric achieved its purpose in one sense. It preserved the appearance of cleanliness. But that appearance depended on what could be seen, not on what was happening beneath the surface. It is easy to believe that a body covered by clean-looking fabric is in a better condition than one marked by visible dirt. But that belief depends entirely on what is allowed to be seen. The layers that protect appearance can also hide what they contain. Moisture trapped within these layers did not remain neutral. It combined with heat from the body, with the natural processes that continued throughout the day, and with the limited ability to change or wash the fabric. Linen absorbed what it could, but once saturated, it no longer acted as a barrier. Instead, it held everything in place. The longer it remained in contact with the skin, the more it became part of the body's condition rather than a protection from it. Changing these garments was not always simple. Access to multiple sets of clean linen depended on resources, time, and the ability to wash and dry them properly. For many, especially outside the wealthiest groups, this was not a daily option. Fabric had to be reused. It had to serve its purpose longer than it was designed to. This extended use transformed it from a protective layer into something that maintained the very conditions it was meant to manage. If we compare this to today, it would be like wearing multiple layers of clothing close to the skin for an entire day without the ability to change them, allowing moisture to build and remain trapped, even when the outer layer still looks clean. The difference between appearance and experience becomes clear in that contrast. Men's clothing, while not free from these issues, allowed for slightly more variation. Fewer layers, greater movement, and more exposure to open air created moments where moisture could lessen. Even if the overall condition remained far from clean, there were small changes that prevented it from becoming entirely constant. The body moved in and out of different states, even if none of those states could be considered truly comfortable. For women, the continuity was stronger. The same layers remained in place, the same areas stayed covered, and the same conditions persisted without significant interruption. The body did not move out of the environment created by the clothing. It remained within it, carrying the effects from morning into night. This created a form of uncleanliness that was less about sudden accumulation and more about steady persistence. Something is unsettling about clothing designed to maintain order on the outside, while quietly holding discomfort against the skin for hours at a time. The purpose of the fabric and its effect on the body do not always align. Over time, this difference shaped how cleanliness was experienced. Men carried dirt that was visible, something that could be recognized and occasionally reduced. Women carried conditions that were hidden, shaped by fabric and structure, and extended across longer periods. The presence of multiple layers did not eliminate uncleanliness. It changed how it appeared and how it was endured. The comparison between the two becomes less about who is cleaner and more about how the body is affected by what it carries. Visible dirt draws attention and reaction. Hidden moisture and trapped conditions do not. Yet the absence of attention does not reduce their impact. It only allows them to continue without interruption. This part has shown how layers of clothing, especially those closest to the skin, created different experiences of uncleanliness by controlling how moisture and heat were held against the body. As attention moves further, the focus begins to shift from the fabric to another part of the body that was often covered and rarely exposed. Next comes hair and head coverings, where oils, sweat, and lack of washing remain trapped for long periods, slowly building into a condition that cannot be easily reduced. Hair in the Middle Ages was not simply a part of the body left exposed to air and light. For many women, it was something that remained covered for most of the day, shaped by expectations of modesty and social order. Fabric wrapped around the head, layers arranged carefully to conceal what lay beneath, and routines built around keeping that coverage in place created a condition that was rarely interrupted. What could have been exposed and aired was instead contained, held close to the skin in a way that changed how it was experienced over time. The scalp, like the rest of the body, produced oils and moisture naturally. Under open conditions, these could disperse, be reduced by air and movement. When covered, however, the situation changed. Fabric limited airflow, trapping heat and preventing the natural drying process. The warmth of the body remained concentrated beneath the layers, allowing moisture to build gradually. What might have been temporary became continuous, shaped not by a single moment, but by hours of steady accumulation. Head coverings varied in form, but their effect was often similar. Cloth wrapped tightly, veils layered over the head, and additional pieces used to secure everything in place created a structure that did not allow for easy removal throughout the day. Once arranged, these coverings remained as they were, forming a closed environment around the hair and scalp. Within that space, the body continued its natural processes, but without the usual means of releasing what it produced. Washing the hair was not a frequent practice. It required time, water, and effort that could not always be spared. Even when it was done, drying the hair fully was not guaranteed. Without proper drying, moisture could remain within the hair itself, creating a condition that did not return quickly to neutrality. When coverings were placed back on top, any remaining dampness became part of the enclosed environment, extending the effect rather than reducing it. Over time, oils from the scalp combined with sweat and the limited airflow beneath the coverings. Fabric absorbed some of this, but like linen worn close to the body, it could only hold so much before it began to maintain the condition rather than manage it. The same coverings were often reused, worn again without being washed as frequently as needed. Each use added another layer, not visible from the outside, but present within the structure itself. It is easy to overlook the condition of what is hidden beneath layers, especially when those layers are arranged to appear orderly and controlled. What remains out of sight does not disappear. It continues, shaped by the same limitations that keep it concealed. In this environment, parasites such as lice found conditions that allowed them to persist. Hair that was rarely fully cleaned, combined with coverings that were not frequently washed, created a space where these issues could develop and remain. Once present, they were not easily removed. Treatment required time, attention, and resources that were not always available. As a result, the condition could continue, becoming part of daily life rather than an isolated problem. The experience was not always immediately visible. Hair remained covered, and any issues beneath the coverings were not exposed to others in the same way that dirt on clothing or skin might be. This created a separation between appearance and reality. From the outside, everything could seem in order. The coverings were in place, the fabric appeared clean enough, and nothing obvious suggested what was being carried beneath. Men, in contrast, often had fewer layers covering the head. Hair was shorter, and in many forms of labour, it remained exposed to the open air. While this did not eliminate issues, it created different conditions. Airflow reduced the build-up of moisture, and the absence of constant coverage allowed for some natural drying. Even without regular washing, this exposure changed how the scalp and hair were affected over time. If we compare this to today, it would be like keeping the hair covered tightly for an entire day, allowing heat and moisture to build without release, while having little opportunity to wash or fully dry it before covering it again. The result would not be immediate discomfort alone, but a steady condition that deepens over time. The difference lies not in whether one experience is entirely clean or entirely unclean, but in how the body is allowed to respond to what it produces. Exposure creates variation, small changes that interrupt build-up. Continuous coverage creates stability of a different kind, one that allows conditions to remain and develop without interruption. Fabric, once again, becomes a central factor. It protects, it conceals, and it maintains appearance, but it also holds what it absorbs. Over time, it becomes part of the condition rather than a solution to it. The coverings do not simply sit on the head. They interact with what lies beneath, shaping how long it remains and how it is experienced. Something is unsettling about a system that preserves the appearance of order while quietly allowing conditions beneath it to continue unchanged. The contrast between what is seen and what is carried becomes more pronounced the longer it persists. This adds another layer to the broader comparison. Men may carry dirt that is visible and immediate, shaped by the outside world. Women may carry conditions that remain hidden, shaped by fabric and structure, and extended across longer periods without clear interruption. Hair and head coverings become one more place where this difference appears, reinforcing the idea that what is unseen can last longer than what is exposed. As the focus continues, attention begins to shift once again, moving away from specific parts of the body and toward how different forms of uncleanliness are recognized and judged. Visibility, smell, and immediate reaction begin to play a larger role in shaping perception. This part has shown how hair and head coverings created a closed environment where oils, moisture, and other conditions could build over time without being easily reduced. As the comparison moves forward, attention begins to turn toward the kinds of uncleanliness that are most noticeable at first contact. What follows is the role of smell itself, where sweat, alcohol, and the body combine into something that cannot be hidden, creating an impression strong enough to define a person before anything else is seen. Smell was often the first thing that defined a person in the Middle Ages, and for many men it was something that formed quickly and stayed close. Before clothing, before posture, before any visible detail could be examined, the body announced itself through what it carried in the air. Sweat, exposure, and daily habits combined into a presence that did not require explanation. It was immediate, direct, and difficult to ignore once noticed. Beards played a central role in this. Facial hair was not always carefully maintained, and even when it was, it remained a place where the traces of daily life gathered. Food particles, drink residue, and dust settled into the hair, held there until they were removed. Without frequent washing, these traces did not disappear on their own. They remained, adding to the overall condition of the body in a way that was both subtle and constant. Over time, the beard became more than a feature of appearance. It became a surface that carried what the body encountered. Drinking added another layer that was just as noticeable. Alcohol was part of daily life for many, and its effects extended beyond the moment of consumption. The smell did not stay only on the breath. It moved through the body, mixing with sweat and settling into clothing and hair. When combined with the conditions of physical labor, it created a scent that was stronger and more complex than either element alone. It lingered, forming part of the person's presence, even when no drink was in hand. Sweat itself was constant. It did not come and go in short bursts. It built gradually, reinforced by long hours of work and limited opportunities for full washing. Clothing absorbed it, but not in a way that removed it from the body entirely. Instead, it held it close, allowing it to deepen over time. Each layer of fabric carried what had been produced before, creating a condition that did not reset easily from one day to the next. Exposure to the outside world intensified all of this. Men spent long periods outdoors, moving through environments that added to what they carried. Dust settled into hair and onto skin. Wind brought particles that stayed within the fabric. Contact with tools, animals, and shared spaces introduced new elements that remained long after the moment had passed. There was no single source of uncleanliness. It came from many directions at once, combining into something difficult to separate. Sleeping conditions reinforced the effect. Many men shared spaces with others, whether in inns, temporary shelters, or crowded living areas. Proximity meant that what one person carried could transfer to another. Bedding was not always clean, and ventilation was limited. The body did not return to a neutral state during rest. Instead, it continued to carry what had already built up, while also absorbing what was present in the surrounding space. It is often the first impression that shapes judgment, and smell has a way of reaching that judgment before anything else has time to form. A person does not need to be seen clearly to be understood in that moment. The body communicates its condition through the air, creating a reaction that is immediate and difficult to reverse. Attention to personal appearance varied, but for many men, it was not the primary concern. Daily survival, work, and movement took precedence over maintaining a controlled outward image. This did not mean that cleanliness was ignored entirely, but it was managed within the limits of what was possible. The result was a condition that reflected those priorities, one where visible and noticeable elements carried more weight than hidden ones. From a distance, this created a clear impression. The combination of beard, sweat, and alcohol formed a presence that was easy to recognize. It did not require close examination or careful observation. It was direct, sometimes overwhelming, and often the first thing that others responded to. In this sense, men often appeared more unclean, not necessarily because they carried more, but because what they carried was easier to detect. If we compare this to today, it would be like standing next to someone who has spent hours working without washing, with sweat and strong smells building to the point where they become the defining feature of their presence. The reaction is immediate, shaped by what can be sensed without effort. This visibility creates a certain kind of clarity. The source of the condition is understood, and the effect is recognized without confusion. It comes from work, from exposure, and from habits that are part of daily life. There is no need to question where it originates. It is present in a way that feels direct and undeniable. There is something deceptive about how quickly visible and noticeable conditions can dominate judgment, even when they are not the most difficult to endure over time. What immediately draws attention, what lingers quietly, does not. This is where the comparison begins to shift again. The kind of uncleanliness carried by men often creates a strong first reaction. It defines the moment, shaping how they are perceived before anything else is considered. But that reaction is based on what is easy to notice, not necessarily on what lasts the longest or feels the most difficult to carry. As the focus moves forward, the question becomes less about what shocks the senses first, and more about what remains when that initial reaction fades. Smell, visibility, and immediate impression begin to lose their dominance, giving way to conditions that are less obvious but more persistent. This part has shown how beards, sweat, and alcohol combined to create a form of uncleanliness that was immediate, recognizable, and often overwhelming in first impressions. As attention shifts further, the comparison begins to move away from what is easiest to detect and toward what is easiest to overlook. A closer look reveals that a strong smell does not always reflect the harshest conditions, and that what remains hidden often lasts far longer than anything noticed at first. Smell often creates the strongest reaction when thinking about uncleanliness, especially in a world where daily life brings the body into constant contact with labour, heat, and limited access to washing. It arrives before sight has time to adjust, before details can be examined, and before any explanation can be formed. For many men in the Middle Ages, this presence was immediate. Sweat, alcohol, and exposure combined into something that defined them the moment they entered a space. It was direct, difficult to ignore, and easy to associate with the idea of being unclean. This immediacy shaped how uncleanliness was understood. What could be smelled quickly was often judged as worse, not because it lasted longer, but because it demanded attention. The body communicated its condition in a way that others could not avoid. It filled the space, reached outward, and created a response without requiring explanation. In this sense, men often appeared to carry the heavier burden of uncleanliness, simply because what they carried could not be hidden. Yet this form of uncleanliness, despite its strength, belonged to a pattern that allowed for interruption. Sweat could be reduced, even if only slightly. Clothing could be aired. A brief contact with water could lessen the immediate effect. These moments did not remove the condition entirely, but they created a separation. The body moved in and out of the state, experiencing it in cycles rather than as a continuous presence. For women, the situation often followed a different pattern. Much of what they carried remained close to the body, held beneath layers of fabric that concealed it from view and contained it within a limited space. Moisture, warmth, and natural processes combined in ways that did not produce the same immediate outward signal. Instead, they created a condition that was quieter, less noticeable to others, but far more constant to the person experiencing it. The absence of strong outward signals does not indicate the absence of difficulty. It simply changes how that difficulty is perceived. What is hidden does not draw the same reaction. It does not create the same urgency. It remains, carried without the same acknowledgement, and often without the same opportunity to be addressed. This creates a gap between appearance and reality, one that is not easily recognized without closer attention. It is easy to assume that what shocks the senses the most must also be the worst, but that assumption begins to weaken when duration replaces intensity as the measure. A strong smell may dominate a moment, but it does not necessarily define how long the body must endure its condition. Layers of clothing play a role in maintaining this difference. They conceal what lies beneath, preserving an outward sense of order while holding on to what the body produces. Moisture remains trapped, heat builds, and the body continues its processes within a space that does not allow for easy release. Over time, this creates a condition that is not marked by sudden impact, but by steady persistence. It is not something that arrives all at once. It is something that continues without interruption. This persistence changes how the body is experienced. Instead of moving in and out of discomfort, the body remains within it. There is no clear moment where the condition can be set aside. It follows the individual through different parts of the day, through different tasks, and into rest. Even when the body is still, the condition does not change. It remains, shaped by the same limitations that prevent it from being removed. If we compare this to today, it would be like judging discomfort only by how strong a smell is, while ignoring a situation where the body is kept in a constant state of dampness and heat, without the ability to change or clean it properly. One demands attention immediately, the other becomes more difficult the longer it continues. History tends to favour what can be easily described. Strong smells, visible dirt, and dramatic conditions are recorded more often, because they are easier to notice and explain. What remains hidden, especially when tied to private aspects of the body, is less frequently documented. It does not create the same reaction, and it does not fit as easily into descriptions that focus on what can be seen and sensed directly. This creates an imbalance in how uncleanliness is remembered. The visible and the noticeable become the defining features, while the hidden and persistent are often overlooked. Yet, when examined closely, it becomes clear that these hidden conditions shape daily life in ways that are just as significant, if not more so. There is something deeply unsettling about a condition that does not announce itself, because it allows it to continue without interruption or recognition. What is loud is addressed. What remains quiet? The comparison between men and women begins to shift at this point. It is no longer about who produces a stronger immediate reaction. It becomes about who must remain within their condition for longer periods without relief. The difference lies in duration, in how long the body carries what it cannot remove, and in whether there is any opportunity to step outside of it, even briefly. Smell, in this context, becomes only one part of a larger picture. It is powerful, but it is not complete. It reveals what is present in a moment, but it does not fully represent what is experienced over time. To understand the full picture, attention must move beyond what is easiest to detect and toward what is hardest to escape. This part has shown that a strong smell, while immediate and striking, does not always reflect the most difficult conditions of uncleanliness. As the focus moves deeper, attention begins to shift toward the parts of the body that are least visible and most difficult to manage. Closer examination reveals how natural bodily processes, especially those that cannot be delayed or ignored, create conditions that remain for days, shaping the experience of the body in ways that are rarely acknowledged. Menstruation introduced a layer of daily life that could not be delayed, reduced, or set aside according to convenience. It followed its own rhythm, independent of work, environment, or access to resources. For women in the Middle Ages, this created a condition that returned regularly and required continuous management, regardless of whether the surrounding conditions allowed for it. The body did not wait for water to be available or for fabric to be clean. It simply continued, and whatever was needed to manage it had to be adapted to the moment. Materials used for this purpose were simple and often limited. Cloth was the most common option, folded and placed close to the body to absorb what could not be avoided. In some cases, softer plant materials or other substitutes were used when fabric was not available. These materials were not designed for repeated use in this way, yet they were used repeatedly out of necessity. Once saturated, they could not always be replaced immediately. They remained in place longer than they should have, held against the body without the opportunity for frequent change. This created a condition where moisture was not only present but continuous. Fabric absorbed what it could, but it also held onto it. Without the ability to change or wash these materials regularly, the body remained in contact with what it produced. The result was not a brief moment of discomfort, but a steady state that extended across hours and sometimes days. Movement did not reduce it, rest did not remove it. It continued, shaped by the limitations of what could be done. Cleaning these materials was not a simple task. Water had to be gathered, and it was not always clean. Washing had to be done in ways that balanced necessity with privacy, which was not always easy to maintain. Drying required time and space, both of which were not always available. Even when washing was possible, the process did not create a complete reset. The same materials would be used again, carrying traces of previous use into the next cycle. The need for discretion added another layer of difficulty. Managing menstruation was not something that could be done openly. It required privacy, even in environments where privacy was limited. This meant that cleaning and changing materials often had to be done in ways that avoided attention, further reducing the frequency with which they could be done properly. The body continued its process regardless of these limitations, creating a situation where management was always incomplete. It is difficult to understand the weight of a condition that cannot be postponed, especially when it must be managed with materials that cannot be replaced as often as needed. The body does not adjust to the environment. The environment must adjust to the body, and when it cannot, the burden remains. Unlike the forms of uncleanliness associated with external labour, this condition came from within. It did not depend on exposure to dirt or contact with the outside world. It was part of the body itself, recurring regularly and requiring attention each time. This made it fundamentally different. It could not be avoided, and it could not be fully removed once it began. It had to be carried until it ended on its own. The effect of this was not always visible to others. Clothing concealed what was happening, maintaining an outward appearance that did not reflect the internal experience. From the outside, there was little to notice. No strong smell that spread across a room, no visible marks that signalled what was being endured. This concealment created a gap between perception and reality, one that allowed the condition to continue without recognition. If we compare this to today, it would be like being required to manage a continuous bodily process for several days without access to reliable materials, clean water, or the ability to change as often as needed. The discomfort would not be a single moment. It would be sustained, shaped by limitations that cannot be easily overcome. Men did not share this experience. Their bodies did not follow the same cycle, and they were not required to manage a recurring condition of this kind. This created a difference that went beyond environment or clothing. It was rooted in the body itself, in a process that could not be transferred or shared. The burden remained with those who experienced it, repeating over time without variation. The combination of limited materials, restricted access to water, and the need for privacy created a condition that was both persistent and difficult to address fully. Each cycle repeated the same challenges, reinforcing the limitations rather than resolving them. There was no accumulation of improvement. Each time began again under the same constraints. There is something deeply unsettling about a condition that returns regularly, knowing that each time it will have to be managed under the same limitations as before. The predictability does not make it easier. It makes the persistence more apparent. Over time, this shaped how the body was experienced. Instead of dealing with a condition that came and went based on external factors, women had to manage something that returned regardless of circumstances. It created a rhythm that did not align with the availability of resources or the demands of daily life. The body followed its own pattern, and everything else had to adjust as best as possible. This adds another dimension to the broader comparison. It is not simply about who becomes unclean more quickly or more visibly. It is about who must manage conditions that are unavoidable, recurring, and difficult to address fully. The difference lies not only in intensity but in repetition, in how often the body must return to the same state without the ability to change the conditions surrounding it. This part has shown how menstruation introduced a recurring condition that required constant management, often without the resources needed to do so effectively. As the focus continues, attention begins to move toward moments when the body experiences even greater physical demands under the same limitations. Closer examination reveals how childbirth and the period that follows create conditions that are more intense, more prolonged, and far more difficult to manage than anything experienced before. Childbirth marked a moment when the body moved beyond ordinary limits and entered a state that could not be controlled or quickly resolved. It was not a brief event that ended once the child was delivered. Instead, it extended into the days that followed, shaping how the body felt, how it functioned, and how it had to be managed under conditions that were already limited. The environment did not change to accommodate this shift. The same materials, the same space, and the same restrictions remained in place, even as the demands on the body increased significantly. After birth, the body did not return to a stable condition. It continued to release fluids, and it required time to recover from the physical strain it had just endured. This was not a small adjustment. It was an ongoing process that could last for days, sometimes longer, depending on the individual and the circumstances. During this time, the body remained in a state that required constant attention, yet the means to provide that attention were limited. Cloth was used to manage what the body produced, placed close to the skin in an attempt to absorb and contain it. These materials were not always fresh, and they could not always be replaced as often as needed. Once they became saturated, they remained in contact with the body until they could be changed. Washing them was not immediate, and drying them required time and space that were not always available. As a result, the same materials were often reused, carrying traces of previous use into the next. The bed itself became part of this condition. It was not simply a place for rest, but a surface that absorbed what the body released. Sheets and coverings were not changed frequently, and they held on to what they came into contact with. The body rested within this environment, not separate from it. Each hour spent lying down reinforced the condition rather than reducing it. What could not be removed during the day remained present at night, creating a continuity that did not allow for relief. Movement did not resolve the situation. Standing, sitting, or lying down all occurred within the same limitations. The body could not escape what it carried, and the surrounding environment reflected that state. There was no clear boundary between the body and its immediate space. Everything became part of the same condition, repeating without interruption. It is difficult to imagine a state where the body cannot be separated from what it produces, especially when that state continues for days without a clear point of relief. The absence of interruption changes the nature of the